Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Media Talks TV with your host Tony J. Um, this segment is called Retrospectives, and in today's segment, we're going to be talking about the 50th anniversary of hip hop, and I wanted to come back and do another video kind of similar to the last two videos that I did. Um, Being that this is August, in the next 2 weeks, we will be celebrating and discussing the cultural impact of hip hop music on the world. But I wanted to take this segment in a different direction, kind of like really discussing my top 50 hip hop albums of all time. And the reason why I wanted to talk about these 50 albums, and the list is not in chronological order, but the reason why I want to talk about this list that I've created is mainly because all of us who have grown up and listened to hip hop music may understand that, you know, there's that one album that really changed your whole perspective. It's that one album that really made you fall in love with hip hop. And I know I have a couple of albums that I grew up listening to, and actually some that actually really got me through high school and really got me through, whatever mood that I was having. And one of the significant things about these albums is, you know, they never, to me, they never die out. And I think in some ways, when we think about those albums, if you just listen to one track, one beat, or a great lyric that you heard, some may go back and say, well, I remember where I was when I first heard that album. I remember where I was when I heard that rhyme. And everybody has a story like that. Um, One time I went to listen to a lecture at my college, Towson University, and Common had stopped through to give a guest. He was a guest speaker at the time because he was promoting his book, One Day It All Makes Sense. And he always talked about one of the significant things that got him into hip hop was the fact that he really, in some ways, he said that there was this group of rappers in his neighborhood. Well, I think it was in Cleveland, called the Barn Hill Crew. And I remember him talking about that and hearing them rap and actually wanting to go home and um, actually write his own rhymes and write his own poetry. And that's how he jumped into rap music. Everybody has that one artist that made them fall in love with the musical genre, you know. Um, I think I could remember very vividly, and maybe in a previous video, um, I remember hearing on my father's stereo when I was younger, Planet Rock by Africa Bambaataa, and that was my first introduction to hip hop. was really um Planet Rock and also LL Cool J's Radio was the second one, and then Kumo D's How You Like Me Now. And I remember those three albums being played on my father's stereo when I was younger. And that made me really get into hip hop music when I was younger because I heard it all around the house. I remember when I was younger, I remember seeing an album cover of Big Daddy Kane and A Taste of Chocolate. I remember that album cover. My father had that album. There were many albums around my house. And then by the time I got to high school, the group that really got me into really wanting to rap or actually write poetry was Public Enemy. And Public Enemy, I remember my teacher giving me um the LP to Anti Nigga Machine. And I remember hearing that song, and I played it on a record player one Christmas when she gave me a crate full of her records. So she let me pick one of those records. And one of the records that she had um, was Public Enemy's Anti Nigga Machine and Brothers Gonna Work It Out. And those were two of the songs from off of Fear of a Black Planet that I actually I actually fell in love with. Like, it was different. Like just to hear the way that the song came on. Brothers Gonna Work It Out was one of my favorite songs from Public Enemy because it just felt different. Um, the screeching of the guitar, there's just a lot of chaos in the song. And it was one of those albums that, I don't forget. And what's so compelling about Public Enemy was they're just one of the first groups to have socially conscious rhymes on their album. Very hard hitting, very politically motivated album. And that's what really got me into what what really made me want to write raps was them. And then um it was my friends in middle school. We all listened to all different types of raps. I know Jay-Z was one, but it was this guy coming out of Houston, Texas called Little Flip. Little Flip was the first hip hop album that I brought at a CD store in a mall. So that was my first kind of foray into Southern rap was Little Flip. That was around like 2004. And I think that was that was a good album because it had a mixture of everything. Well, Little Flip was one of those albums. But as far as the list go, I'm gonna break this show up into different different episodes. So it's not gonna be long winded like all my other videos were. But I'm gonna go from this episode, I'm gonna go from 1 to 10 in the albums, and then the next episode I'll do 10 to 20, and then 20 to 30, 40, 50, and so on and so on. So I'm not going to do the whole list, but I'm going to break down the first 10 albums. Now, the first 10 albums that I like, I will put this disclaimer out there. I didn't grow up in the 80s, okay? But I love 80s music. I love the sound of the 80s. Mainly because 80s music cannot be replicated. You can't replicate 80s music today. Even if people try to attempt to do a cover of an 80s song, it wouldn't work because the technology in the 80s was different. You know, they had synthesizers, they had Moog synthesizers. They didn't have samplers yet. They had the Lynn drum machine. And most of the greatest albums were made off of electrical instruments, instruments that weren't really necessarily naturally acoustic, like what you might find in the 70s and in the 60s and stuff like that. Once the 80s came around, everything was electronic dance music, and everything had to have MIDI in it. And MIDI is basically computer interface with all the instruments, where the instruments are electrical and had to communicate with each other. So we're not going to get a natural sound coming out of the 80s. You're always going to get that synthesizer or that drum machine, or more kind of natural stripped down, not necessarily acoustic, natural acoustic music or percussive music that you might have found before the 80s. So when I think about 80s hip hop, one of the first albums that I enjoyed listening to when I was younger, most definitely um Houdini, you know. Um One of the primary reasons I like Houdini was mainly because they were a natural group of rappers. You know, everybody who listened to Houdini would naturally gravitate towards them because their music, everybody loved Houdini. They had a really a broad appeal. So older people would gravitate towards them. They liked them. Kids liked them, but it was also, they were one of the first rap groups to have sex appeal way before LL Cool J. And that's one of the interesting things about Houdini. They had a balance of love songs. They had a balance of street and pop songs. Um, when I think about Houdini, I always think about, Freaks Come Out at Night, 5 Minutes of Funk, Friends. Um, they were the, you know, they were coined your parents' favorite rappers. So that's the appeal that they had. But what's so important about Houdini is, you know, Houdini is introduced to, well, helps us to be introduced to up and coming DJ Mr. Magic. And I remember hearing Mr. Magic's one on Grand Theft Auto's Vice City. And luckily for me, and I say this over and over again, that I think what saved a lot of these rappers is the fact that a lot of their songs ended up in that video game. And, I didn't know much about Houdini beyond that, but when I remember hearing Mr. Magic's one and Grand Theft Auto Vice City when I was about 13 years old. And what made it so interesting was, just the way that the song started off. Like, I started gravitating towards listening to Houdini because of that video game. Um, and even though I've heard a lot of the stuff from them when I was younger, is really Friends is probably one of the most well-known songs from Houdini. But I also remember that Nas sampling that song for If I Ruled the World. So it kind of all comes full circle for Houdini. And I guess out of all of the groups, the appeal for me was the fact that they had a very friendly radio appeal to a lot of really to a lot of listeners. So I always put Houdini at the very top of the list as being some of the greatest hip hop groups. Their first album, which has Mr. Magic One, was probably one of their best albums. Um, I I enjoyed it very thoroughly. I listen to it from time to time. So I feel as though, you know, I think it's just no way I can say, you know, I cannot have a list of some of the greatest hip hop albums without putting Houdini at the top of that list. You know, so that's important. I would say that's very important. Now the next group, you know, the next group I want to talk about is the Crash Crew. You know, um, I remember Crash Crew when I was younger. I remember listening to Crash Crew when I had cable. They had this thing called Music Choice, and they had this song. I forgot the name of the song. It goes like, "This is the way. This is the way. This is the way we harmonize. Ah ah ah. We are known as MCs and and they had this thing where they would go from round to round and talk about brag about their style of how they rhyme. And I think it's one of the greatest old traditional um rap groups to come out of the early 80s. We turn parties out. That was my favorite song. Like, I love listening to that song. I don't think that song will ever in anybody's mind. I don't think that song will ever die out. I don't care what you say. It's just traditional. Like if you really want to know what traditional rap battles or rap braggadocious rhymes sound like, you listen to the Crash Crew. Crash Crew is just one of the greatest to come out of Sugar Hill Records. And they had another song. Um, they had another song that I like, but We Turn Parties Out was one of my favorite ones because a lot of the raps back then went on for almost 7 to 10 minutes. I don't think anybody has really beat that record for a album that long. But a lot of the raps back then, it went on for almost 10 minutes, close to 8 minutes. And the Crash Crew and Furious Five, all those guys um were important, you know, and they're really Crash Crew is very underrated in a sense, you know. And the next the next one that I really want to talk about, the next one I really want to talk about is um I guess it's the Furious Five. I'll you know like I said, like there is you know there's no other group, period, than the Furious Five. Now we could talk about anything in hip hop. The message will always remain at the top of that list. If you don't know the message word for word, then I have to really question your sanity. And then I also have to question whether or not you're a hip hop head. Because everybody that ain't a hip hop head knows what that song what that song is. There's just no way to get around it. Song is up there with, My Girl Ain't Too Proud to Beg. Next, I believe that the message will be up there with Ain't Too Proud to Beg and Ball of Confusion and all the Pusher Man. That kind of is up there with those songs, those 70 songs. Um, when you think about the 80s and the mass confusion, Reaganomics, crack, you think about you really do think about that song. You think about Don't Push Me Cause I'm Close to the Edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. And that's basically what the 80s was. Junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. Don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. And if you think about it, that's the most conscious album. Is really, I kind of considered it the first gangster rap album in a sense because it was reality. And what Melly Mel was talking about really describes Reagan era New York City during that time, what the Bronx looked like, the deranged people on the streets, people getting pushed in front of subway trains. Um, that's what that song represents. That's why I say it's up there. It's in the next 20 years, it will be up there with Ball of Confusion. Because if you go back and you think about Ball of Confusion, Ball of Confusion was about, you know, the 60s going into the 70s. You know, people moving out, people moving in. Why? Because of the color of the skin. Think about it. This that song kind of represents what the 70s was like. And if you hear that Temptation song, people moving out, people moving in. Why? Because of the color of the skin. They're talking about white flight. They're talking about white flight. And that's what the song really was about. That, and then also what's going on, and everything. That CD with Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, talks about really the street life and the drugs and Vietnam and all that stuff. But this I believe that the message will become and is already a very important album because of what it represents. And I think in the history books, if you look, if if there was ever a history book created that talked about America during the 1980s, I would put Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five in the opening of that book. It'd be like a McGraw Hill type book. And then you open the chapter and it has, you know how a McGraw Hill book looks, America in the 1940s, and it has the World War II ships in the front, America during wartime. And then, say for instance, if you have a McGraw Hill textbook, right, or Prentice Hall textbook, and you want to say, chapter 7, America during the age of Reagan, and then you open the book, and then in the very big front is Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, the whole goddamn group. That is what that song, the message represents. And then it has their song in quotes and air quotes. Don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. And then you turn the chapter, and then it says Ronald Reagan gets elected president. America during Reaganomics. And then it has that little bold print, what is Reaganomics? And then it goes back and highlights the picture of Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. You know, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And their picture is in there. And it says, America in the 1980s, the gap between the rich and the poor widens. And the message comes out to explain that. And that's essentially what that song was about. There's no other song more American than the message. But you can't get white America to understand that. Because in the 80s, white America was all about getting rich, whereas though black America was just trying to survive the poverty. And the message comes out and says broken glass everywhere, people pissing on the streets, they just don't care. Roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. See how, you know, don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. Like a jungle sometimes, and make it wonder how to keep from going under. It's one of the greatest songs of all time. Like I said, it's more American than apple pie. It's the most American song next to Ball of Confusion. Then there's the Treacherous Free. Now, some of the best music, and I've said the Treacherous Three is one of my top four because Treacherous Three, you know, it helped to push Kumo D. It really helped to push Kumo D into becoming a solo artist. And the thing that's very compelling about Kumo D is that Kumo D is the only artist from the old school era that he's the only artist from the old school era that can make the transition properly. He makes the transition properly to becoming one of the solo artists, one of the best solo artists by battling LL Cool J. Nobody dared to even battle Kumo D, mainly because he was already an established battle rapper. He had already beaten Busy B, Chief Rocker Busy B. So he was well known in Harlem and all over the Bronx of his ability to battle rap and battle any MC. Sometimes I don't understand how Kumo D is never talked about or never discussed as being some of the greatest, really being the greatest rap artists to actually come out of the old school, be in a group, come out of the old school, battle rap one of the biggest MCs, and then also challenge a newer MC and actually, become more well known. The one of the biggest things about one of the biggest things that I find particularly intriguing about Kumo D is that he was the one of the first rappers to actually bring intellect to the music itself. He had a very expansive vocabulary. Even if you listen to the song "Turn It Up," it's one of his best songs. Like the way that he uses vocabulary and his cadence, it really stands out. But even in the old school era where it was very simplistic, his vocabulary and how he used it made his raps very complex. You know, so "Turn It Up" is one of my favorite songs from the Treacherous Three. Um, Number five, most definitely number five, Self Destruction. You know, um, that song, even now, I still feel like there's a need for that song to actually make a comeback with the new artists that are out. And what I'm surprised is this song was one of the first songs to address the issue of violence in rap music, because during that time when this song came out, um they had already dealt with the death of Scott LaRock, and that death really, out of all of us, he was one of the first. Scott LaRock was one of the first um people to fall in hip hop amid gun violence. And even to this day, um it left Scott LaRock's death left a footprint that to this day still resonates with what's going on currently with the genre itself when it comes to the issue of gun violence. Um, there's not another song that could supersede Self Destruction, which is actually very sad. And I'm also disappointed in the fact that there has not been another song like Self Destruction out. You have all these rappers, even today, they've never gotten together and said, we got to do something to stop the gun violence in our community. They're glorifying the violence. Whereas though with this song, you know, it it basically typifies the issue that, telling people that, you got to stop the violence and put the guns down. And, hip hop during that time had issues with people getting shot for gold chains, people getting robbed for being chain snatchers and everything. And this was the result of that, also leading up to Scott LaRock's um after the death of Scott LaRock. This is the time when hip hop really had a conscience. There's no other, I don't think there's any other artist out there that really kind of took a stance about stopping the violence in a stop the violence movement. So self destruction is in my, number five, one of my favorite top albums and songs And of course, Rockbox by Run DMC, you know, Rockbox by Run DMC, another great top hip hop song that really catapulted Run DMC to actually get on MTV. You know, being that this is actually August 1st, because this is August 1st, so um I think this is the 42nd or 43rd birthday for MTV. So, you know, the fact that they were able to get on MTV and cross over and do something like Rockbox and get white kids to actually like listening to hip hop. Because remember, there was a time. There was a time when white people did not want to listen to hip hop. They was into rock music, you know, and new wave. But then Rockbox came out and Run DMC became one of the first artists to actually get on MTV, and that was pretty fucking big, even for the town that they were in, because MTV only showcased new wave music videos and maybe rock heavy metal videos, stuff like that, like Van Halen and shit. But Rockbox was also another song that I end up liking, taking a liking to, mainly because of Grand Theft Auto Vice City. And if anybody wants to wonder why I like these songs, it was because of Grand Theft Auto Vice City. When I played that game, they had those songs on there and they exposed us to a newer generation that had not grown up listening to those songs. I didn't grow up in the era of Run DMC. You know, I grew up, like I said, I grew up in the era of Tupac and Biggie and Nas and Lauryn Hill and Big Pun. So I didn't get that. I didn't get that exposure, you know. Um, you know, but Rockbox is one of those songs you can't really get out of your mind. Of course, Boogie Down Productions, another one. I didn't start listening to Boogie Down Productions until high school. You know, I didn't start listening to that album until high school because I didn't know nothing about Boogie Down Productions. I didn't know anything about that. It's probably one of the hardest albums I ever listened to. One of my favorite tracks on there is Super Ho. That's one of my favorite tracks. Not enough time song. He is Super Ho. Super, 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 super. He is Super Ho. That was my favorite. That was my favorite song on there, and Poetry. That was another song on there, and of course, Criminal Minded and Bridges Over. Like they had all those songs on there. South Bronx is another one too. Um, and this really came out in 1987. And what I heard from that it was an interesting. It was very interesting, the story behind that album. It was a turning point for Boogie Down Productions because some of the stuff that they were glorifying in the album led to Scott LaRock's demise. And it was one of those albums where, it was the best. It was a great album because it put South Bronx back on the map again as being the mecca of hip hop. And it ignited the bridge wars in a lot of ways. Um, I remember hearing a story about um, Mr. Magic and Molly Mall, um, and how I think there was a story where KRS-One went to get their song played on Rap Attack, and it kept constantly getting rejected from Mr. Magic. And the story went like they stole a roll of tape that belonged to Marley Marl because he was from Queens, and they used that tape, sampled it, and that's how they made South Bronx. I remember hearing that story a long time ago. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's probably one of the most beautiful stories I've heard. You steal a roll of tape, take it, sample it, and then go to DJ Red Alert, which is another competing radio station across from WBLS, and you play the sampled version of that tape over the airways. It's just one of those crazy stories. I love hearing that story of how they basically took over the radio at that time. Because back in the 80s and in the 70s, radio had a lot of influencing power. Nowadays, radio doesn't have that anymore, which is sad. But behind that album, it's just one of those albums you just really can't forget. Um, I know I listened to that album. I had that album, and it was one of my favorite albums. And then the other one, the one that BDP made, um, the one that BDP made, I actually I actually liked it because by any means necessary, um, which is one of my favorite ones. I just I just felt like it was one of the best they've ever done. It was one of the best KRS-One did because he turned over a new leaf after doing Criminal Minded. He got away from the glorification of violence after the death of his mentor and his DJ Scott LaRock. And you know, one of the greatest examples about KRS-One was he saw the negativity that he was promoting in his first album, which is Criminal Minded, and he decided to turn everything around and make a complete 360-degree turn away from the glorification of violence into promoting consciousness. And that's what, in my book, makes him one of the greatest rappers and one of my favorite. You know, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't listen to KRS-One. I love KRS-One. I like the talent. I admire his talent, but I also admire the fact that he has put out a body of work that has stood the test of time, and he promoted positivity and was mindful of what he put out to the well because he knew it could come back to hurt him. Um, and that's why this is one of my top number 7 Boogie Down Productions, Criminal Minds. Next one, of course, you can't forget Public Enemy. You know, can't forget Public Enemy. I can't talk about conscious rap unless I mention Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. Like I said, out of all the albums that I've gotten over the years, Public Enemy remains to be a part of my hip hop CD collection. For it's been that way for a long time. And what got me into listening to Public Enemy, like I said, my music teacher, and also the fact that, and I hate saying this, but um, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas gave us that album. They put that song, Night of the Living Bassheads, on the video game on San Andreas, and I started listening to it and I started loving it. I still like that song. One of my favorite songs of all time. Um, I never saw anything as edgy as Public Enemy. How they borrowed a lot of stuff they borrowed from the Fruit of Islam, which I started noticing with the S1Ws. They took a lot of that from the Nation of Islam. But it remains to be seen how important, how culturally important Public Enemy, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, how important that album was. It's culturally significant. Came out in 1988, which 1988 is the most important year for hip hop, because hip hop during that time becomes a legitimate musical genre. You start seeing sections in record stores specifically for hip hop music during the late 80s, early 90s. So it becomes the most consumable product now. and that's thanks to maybe Def Jam and Public Enemy and maybe Cold Chillin' Records, was another record company that was really putting out a lot of rap albums during that time. But this is one of the best albums. Like I wish I had got this on wax. I've been talking about maybe getting that on wax. Maybe if I go to a record store, maybe find that because I haven't gotten it. I haven't gotten that on vinyl yet. I need to get it on vinyl. I have it on CD. I have a digital copy, but I don't have it on vinyl, unfortunately. Now, moving on. Last two for the day. Uh Gotta talk about Ice T Hour album cover. I remember getting Ice T. I was in the eighth grade going into the ninth. No, I was in the 10th grade. I was in the 10th grade and I remember how important, how much I love that fucking album cover. Um, out of all the West Coast rappers, Ice T has always been the main one that I've gone back to. But that whole album was beautiful. That whole album was beautiful. It represented something different. Ice T was that type of person. It was different. And if you look at it, it's still iconic. It's still like Power is still one of the most iconic album covers. I mean, ain't no badder chick than Darlene Ortiz. Ain't no badder chick in the world than Darlene Ortiz. And I remember I saw this. I went to the record store. I got Crime Pays. That was the first album. I got Crime Pays. I mean, well, it's called Rhyme Pays actually, not Crime Pays. Rhyme Pays. But Ice T Power, that was my favorite one because it had High Roll on it. High Roll is one of my favorite songs on that whole album, and Pusher Man. It was the way that he flipped it. But when I saw I saw the I saw the album, but I also saw the music video, and I didn't know how good the music video was going to be. But High Rollers was good because I, it was like it basically he gave you the lesson about being in the streets and what the end result of being a high roller was all about, what the drug game was all about. He gave you the ins and outs of that drug game. And out of all the albums that Ice T has made, this is one of his best ones. Like I had to rank it. Um, also like Freedom of Speech. You gotta watch what you say. It came out in '89 in Sire Records. Um, You Played Yourself was one of my favorite songs. I remember having that album. Um, but like I said, there was no album cover more iconic in the '80s than this album cover. You open it, it was like you opened the back of it and you looked at the back of the album cover, the front and the back of the album cover was badass. Darlene Ortiz is holding the shotgun. He's holding the Uzi. Evil E got the 12 gauge sawed off. She got the 12 gauge. He got the sawed off. He got the Uzi. It is just an interesting, really interesting um album cover. So you know, if you ever get a chance to listen to that album, it's just one of my favorite albums of all time. You got a lot of bangers on that album. Me personally, between that and Original Gangster, I don't know where to rank it. You could put that in a description box, or comment. Maybe you could see where that goes. What do you think? Well, what's your favorite Ice-T album? I will say that. Um, you could rank it, put it in the description box, or actually, leave a comment down below. Let me know which one is your favorite album. You know, and the very last one we're gonna do for today, of course, we're gonna do Radio. Um, LL Cool J will always be one of my favorites, but Radio was really one of the songs that I heard playing around my father's house. I actually got the original cassette at home, so you know, the cassette is really good. I mean, I have the CD version. My dad has the cassette version. My dad had the cassette version. But I remember this being played around my house and how very important that whole album was. And, you know, it was just something unique about LL Cool J as a battle rapper, but also how really how he puts how he puts rhymes together, and being that this is his first album, this is the one that really kind of like he was only 16 when he did that album, and it's hard to believe that he was 16 when he dropped this album. But the style in which he was coming out of Queens, because Run DMC came first, and then LL came right behind it. Um, it's just amazing how Queens really has a different way of carrying themselves in terms of how they influence hip hop, because they've had everything on a silver platter. Queens has the most lyrical MCs. Queens has the most conscious rappers. There's just no other. Um, there's no other group of rappers that I would say are the greatest, except for maybe Queens rappers. So LL is still in that category. And you know, like I said, being that I grew up with Cool J's music, you know, I kind of understand why his audience were women, because I think in some cases you really want to appeal to both sides of everything. And I think LL was able to do that. And LL has had longevity in this game for a very long time. For him to go from that to Around the Way Girl, stuff that he did with Track Masters, and putting Track Masters on the path to success, being one of the great, being some of the greatest producers in hip hop with Around the Way Girl and Walking with a Panther. I actually like my favorite L Cool J album will be between Walking with a Panther and Around the Way Girl. Because from Around the Way Girl, it's got my favorite song, Jangling Baby, on there. But this this one is really culturally important because you know it really represents what Queens is all about. That whole swagger about Queens, because Queens, people forget Queens is a suburb. It's not all projects. So LL and Run DMC, they all grew up in middle class, working class households. They weren't really from no hoods. So I would say, LL is still in my rotation as being some of my favorite albums because radio is kind of near and dear to me because, like I said, I grew up watching my father listen to these albums and I took a liking to them. So that's one of the things I said, you know, was important to me. But other than that, that's 1 through 10 for today. We're going to do 10 to 20 tomorrow. And I'm going to discuss those because a lot of the ones that I'm going to discuss are some of my favorite West Coast albums. The some coming from Philly, so I'm going to jump around a little bit. We're going to get to the 90s soon, but I'm really still in the late to mid 80s with the 10 through 20 list. So, stay tuned for the next episode. If you're new here, hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment down in the comment box, leave a comment down below here. And you know, thank you for continuing to, watch my videos and try and engage with them as much as you can. So this has been an episode of Media Talks TV, the segment Retrospectives. We're going to continue this discussion on the next episode. I'll see you. I'm out. Thank you.